Thanks all for coming. My name is Sheila Sai, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow with the U.S. Forest Service in the Southern Research Station in Raleigh-Durham. And I'm also affiliated with NC State University. And today I'm going to share with you how I've incorporated the open source programming language R into some of the work that I've done. And so my title officially is Mapping in R, but I also want to acknowledge that I've done some of this work using Python as well. So I'll talk about how I've used both of these open source programming languages to look at where in Western North Carolina future increases in Streamflow will overlap with vulnerable communities. And so I'd like to thank some of my collaborators for their input from the Forest Service and NC State right off the bat. And so why might we be interested in managing future water resources in North Carolina? Well, researchers project that temperatures in the southeast U.S. are likely to increase, and while there's still some uncertainty about what that temperature increase means for precipitation and ultimately streamflow, climate scientists generally agree that the southeast U.S. can expect more extremes. So wetter events will be wetter or heavier rainfalls, and drier events will be drier, longer duration of droughts. And you can read more about that in the new climate assessment that just came out. Besides changes in climate, researchers also project that urban development in the southeast U.S. is likely to increase in the future. And so for our study watershed, which I'll explain more about our study watershed later, we know that in 1992, about 10% of our watershed was urban developed land, and that's projected to increase to about 36% in 2060. And we can see especially large increases near Winston, Salem, and Charlotte, near urban areas. So together, climate change and urban development are going to impact streamflow, and that leads to higher peak flows, less infiltration, less groundwater recharge, and a higher potential for streamflows, both high and low, to harm nearby communities. And so with those impacts coming down the pipe, at the Forest Service, we're interested in integrating both socioeconomic impacts and using tools like the Social Vulnerability Index to look at these socioeconomic impacts, as well as biophysical impacts. And we can use hydrology models like the Soil and Water Assessment tool to do that. So for this project, we used a tool to integrate these socioeconomic and biophysical impacts on climate and land use change, and that's called the risk matrix, and I'll explain each of these three different tools that I used. So the Social Vulnerability Index, there are many different ways to calculate this, but the one that we used was developed by Flanagan and others, and includes 15 different census variables. It's commonly used to identify and serve communities that are likely to have a limited capacity to prepare, respond, recover, and adapt to climate change and other environmental hazards. And the larger that Social Vulnerability Index value, the more vulnerable a particular community. The data set that we used has the Social Vulnerability Index at the census tract scale, and you or I could download that data from the Center for Disease Control website shown here. So for the biophysical aspects of this study, we used a popular hydrology model called the Soil and Water Assessment tool, or SWAT, and it runs in ArcGIS. And uses a number of different inputs that are listed here, which are, in the US at least, publicly available. And so we can use historic streamflow records to calibrate or fit the SWAT model. And then once we have a fitted model, we can import in climate projections, which we've downscaled to a particular region, and use that to project future stream flow. So for this particular study, we looked at two types of events, stream flow events. So ones that are more commonly used in infrastructure design, these are 10-year flows. And then also extreme flows, and these are considered statistical outliers. And so the goal was for both of these types of events to calculate a % change in the number of those two types of events between a historic period and a future period. And so that particularly I'm looking at daily stream flow there. And then the risk matrix to explain how we've basically combined both that socioeconomic data and the hydrology data. This is the framework that we used. And so you can see let me step back a little bit. This framework was first used in a New York City panel on climate change report. And here it defines risk as the product of magnitude of consequence, which we represent using that social vulnerability index. And so it's that multiplied, or this, and also this % change in streamflow events, which represents the likelihood of impact. And so for each subbasin in our watershed, and I'll explain why that's important later, we'll have an X and a Y coordinate, and we can plot it on this matrix, and then we can classify where that subbasin falls and determine risk from that. And so here in this matrix, quadrants that are colored yellow represent low risk, quadrants that are orange represent medium risk, and quadrants that are high represent high risk, that are red represent high risk. So here's our study site. It's the Yadkin PD watershed in western North Carolina. And up here in this inset, you can see there's 28 different subbasins, and these form the basic unit of our analyses. So I'll explain more about that later, but these subbasins are all delineated by that hydrology model, that SWAT model. And so, yeah. So getting back to R and Python, there were three main tasks that I had to accomplish in order to generate maps for climate change adaptation planning. And so first, I had to rescale the social vulnerability index data. Remember I said it was at the census tract scale, but we wanted to do analysis at the subbasin scale. I also had to wrangle some of the SWAT data. The model spits out these text files that have a sort of odd type of formatting because they're generated by Fortran. So had to work on getting that data into a more usable form, and then to analyze and map some of the spatial results and to join the tabular data with the spatial data. I used R for that. So looking at that first step, so why might I have to rescale the census or the social vulnerability index data I mentioned? So here's an example subbasin outlined in black. This is at the lower part of the watershed. And you can see that there are three different counties that this subbasin overlaps. And there are three different census tracts that it also overlaps. So I needed to figure out a way to basically find a total or average value for social vulnerability for that one particular subbasin. So to do that, this is where I use Python. And so what we could do is we could automate this using Python scripting in ArcPy. And so for each subbasin, we would basically clip out or use the subbasin as a mask, and then find the census tracts within that. And then we could, based on the area of each census tract within the subbasin, we could determine an area-weighted average subbasin social vulnerability index. But you can see that, like for example, this subbasin 20, maybe the average would obscure some of that smaller resolution of data. So we see, like, especially in the middle, like there's some pretty vulnerable communities in there. So when I was doing this analysis, I also recorded the maximum social vulnerability index. And so that represents a very vulnerable community. So like the most vulnerable community in that census tract. And that will be clear why I did that on the next slide. So here we have those basically spatially averaged results. And so we see at the subbasin scale, there are quite a few vulnerable subbasins at the lower part of the watershed, but also scattered throughout. The especially high one here, subbasin 25. And then what I was mentioning before, why it's important for us to include both the subbasin scale and then the finer resolution data, is because we see so here we have a census tract social vulnerability index on the Y and the subbasin ID that corresponds to these numbers here on this figure. And we see, so each dot on this figure represents a census tract. And so we can see, for example, for subbasin 8, we have some census tract social vulnerabilities that are as low as 3, so that they're not very vulnerable. But then we have very high vulnerable communities as well. So we really need to think about like those vulnerable communities. And we see there, based on this range, there's quite a large disparity in that particular subbasin. Is that all I want to say? Yeah. Okay, so this is to kind of explain why it's important to use, why I needed to use R for basically manipulating some of the data that was coming out of this hydrology model. And so you can see if I basically read it into R without doing anything, it comes in as like one big column, and maybe each row doesn't represent a unique observation. So there's no columns here for any different type of variable. And so I can use this tidyverse package, which is a new package in the R world, and it has a lot of very powerful functions to manipulate tabular data in a pretty straightforward and intuitive way. And so I could use those functions to create a custom function to manipulate these tables. And so using that function that I created, we can get a much more like usable data frame for that. And so here we can see there's the subbasin IDs and then the dates, and then of course I needed that Streamflow to calculate the % change in the number of events. So the tidyverse package in R was very helpful for that. So then the last step is that I needed to both combine these two data sets and then plot them spatially, or map them spatially, I should say. So for each subbasin, I had an X and a Y value that corresponded to a different quadrant, and then I could take that class. So for example, this point is in a red quadrant, so that subbasin that is associated with that gets mapped back on to the overall watershed map. And so I could do this for a number of different simulations and things like that in a scripting environment. And so to do that, I use this SF package, which is a really new package in R, and it's really useful for, it's primarily used for vector data, vector spatial data, and it stands for simple features. So yeah, there's a lot of basic operations that we do in other programs that we can do here, like clipping and projecting and things like that, which you can actually do just in the command line. And then the other cool thing about the SF package is that it works really well with that tidyverse package that I mentioned before. So it can bring in and take out tabular data quite easily, and you can manipulate tabular data alongside your spatial data. So here are the overall results of some of the study and here you can see all of the subbasins in both the 10-year flow and the extreme flow cases where there was a greater than 50% increase in the number of either 10-year or extreme flow events in the future, and where vulnerable communities were, especially vulnerable communities were located. So where those stream flow events overlapped with vulnerable communities. And so we can see that there are I want to back up. So we can see there's quite a few subbasins that are showing up in both of these cases, and so that can help us really pinpoint where we would want to maybe start helping communities in terms of climate change adaptation planning. And so we'll look at one specific subbasin that's showing up in both of these cases. And so here you see the same outline here for that subbasin. This is the subbasin that includes a tributary of Richardson Creek and the city of Monroe. And in the background of this image, you can see the social vulnerability index data plotted there. And we see that there are especially vulnerable communities that are located right along the stream in this case. And so they might be a good place to start in terms of helping and including them in climate change planning. So I also want to mention the caveat that this is stream flow changes, like I'm looking at high flow changes, which doesn't necessarily translate to flooding, but I think in future study, in the future, I would like to look at how maybe floodplains could be incorporated into this analysis so that we can identify whether or not the increases in the number of these extreme or 10-year flow events really translate into flooding for this particular area. So in conclusion, R and Python have been really helpful for my work, and I hope maybe I've kind of given you some ideas of how you might be able to use them in your own work. This project is just the first step. So I'm not a social scientist, I'm a hydrologist by training. So it's important to collaborate with other experts like sociologists and other community members to really identify and verify whether these areas really need help and what kind of help they might need in terms of planning for climate change. And so we did this work just in the Yadkin PD watershed, but the Forest Service, we'd like to use it to expand to other watersheds that have done some hydrology modeling of both current and future projections of stream flow. And then also there's a newer package called the Tidy Census package for R, which allows you to basically bypass the whole ACS website and download data from the census directly into R, and then you can start playing with it and mapping it, and also just making other figures. And so I'd like to kind of try to use that and look at social vulnerability index trends over time for this particular region. So here are some of the resources that I talked about in the different R packages and Python libraries, and I should have quite a bit of time for questions.
Have you considered looking at the footprint database the state has and overlaying it with the flood maps?
I haven't actually incorporated flood maps into this work, but I think that would be, that would definitely be an interesting question, is like bringing the flood maps and then also bringing in, our houses or other areas like going to be inundated in the future. Now that we have these stream flow projections, I think we could be using the stream flow projections in like a lot of different ways, but this was just like the first step. Yeah, it's a good question. Good idea. Any other questions? Yeah.
How is this data translated into the policy side of assisting these vulnerable areas?
Yeah, so we have, I showed one of the last few slides, those like high-risk maps. And so we haven't done this yet, but at the Forest Service, we're going to, present this to policymakers in the region my boss will likely do that. So definitely showing them these maps and showing them, especially where subbasins are turning up in both like the 10-year flow and the extreme flow cases, like those might be good places to start helping them plan for future climate change, and land use change.
Would it be helpful information for the emergency management group at the state level to have access to that similar to that same map?
Yeah, we'd be willing to share it for sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If that's what you're asking, yes. Yes, we'd be willing to share that. Yeah. And of course, like I only showed the high risk cases. So we have maps basically of the whole spectrum, like low to high risk. But it's just a lot going on in one figure. So I just focus on the high risk in this presentation. But yeah, I could see how even like medium risk, that would be good information for policymakers to have as well.
And the low risk would be important to know where to set up a staging area.
Yeah, that's true.
Deployment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then another thing about this social vulnerability index that's in the background is they have different themes like within the index. So like basically there's a separate index like in terms of like just housing and like transportation access. So like I could see how that would be very important to like map just those variables onto a map like this. Yeah. Any other questions? Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for staying till the end.